Today is Monday, April 8th. Today happens to be the day of an eclipse. That's sort of big public news. And I know many of the students told me that they were going to be paying attention to the eclipse today at 3 p.m. rather than this class. And even outside right now, I can see the light outside my office window is starting to get strange. So the light may dim over the course of this lesson, but this lesson is being recorded, as I said, in the midst of an eclipse today. I understand the excitement about an event that only occurs once every so many years, but um, I think it's pretty simple to say that the eclipse won't affect anything for us as far as our lives are concerned, and the interest in it's kind of strange. It's almost like we're reverting to superstitious times with respect to astronomical events. But today we're going to pick up where we left off in this lesson in classical arithmetic. We're going to pick up with chapter 2 of Nicomachus's introduction to arithmetic. A video was provided back in the fall term that introduced the study quite well, I think, so I'm not going to rehash that information. We're going to pick up with chapter 2, which is still dealing with some of the fundamental background issues in classical arithmetic, as we'll see in a minute. But in order to get started, what I'd like to do is first share my screen, and then we'll back up a little bit into chapter 1. We'll back up a little bit into chapter 1 just to remind ourselves of where we left off. And again, I encourage you, if you're either getting started or resuming this study in the spring term, to go back and watch that introductory video where I got into the background pretty thoroughly. We talked about a desire for wisdom, and Nicomachus, who's a follower of Pythagoras, said that wisdom is the knowledge of real things, the science of real things. Wisdom is the science of real things. And then we talked about what real things are. We talked about the fact that real things are things which never change, things which always remain according to their essential being, as he said. And just to pick up and remind ourselves of what we left off with back in the fall term, we read that bodiless things, those are the real things, bodiless things, of which we conceive in connection with or together with matter, such as qualities, quantities, configurations, largeness, smallness, equality, relations, actualities, dispositions, places, times, all those things in a word, whereby the qualities found in each body are comprehended. All these are of themselves immovable and unchangeable, but accidentally they share in and partake of the affections of the body to which they belong. So if you look at this list, what you notice here is that we've got a list of different attributes that are present in substances or subjects. So when we get to this idea of real things, of bodiless things, we're moving away from material things into the realm of ideas, or at least immaterial things that exist without change forever. And we've got this list of attributes, qualities, quantities, configurations, largeness, smallness, and so on. Some of these things pertain to the mathematical sciences. Some of them pertain to natural philosophy. And Nicomachus is going to focus in on those which pertain to mathematics. And before I get into chapter 2, I just want to discuss this a little bit for the sake of review to make sure it's clear before we move on. Aristotle explained that when we think about the pursuit of wisdom, we think about the pursuit of an understanding of the true nature of things as they exist in themselves. They divide into 3 different kinds of things. And this division, as Aristotle explains it, and as I'll explain it, seems pretty simple. It seems easy to understand, easy to to think about. But this is actually the cause of all of the confusion in the history of philosophy. This is truth that Aristotle established and that we sort of take for granted, but which is rejected by many as not being true. They don't want this to be true for a number of important reasons. But Aristotle said things divide into three different kinds of things that exist. There are things which are immaterial, that they never participate in any physical body. They have no physical material existence. He would refer to these as theological or metaphysical. These are immaterial things that exist and never have any connection to the material world, the metaphysical things. And that's why metaphysics is referred to as first philosophy, because it deals with that which is considered the first cause or first mover in the universe, an unmovable first mover. That's the subject of metaphysics. And then on the other hand, we have those things which must exist in bodily form, in material form, and those are called physical things, and the study of them is called natural philosophy or physics. So we've got two opposite extremes: metaphysical on one side, things that never exist in any material connection, and then physical things which must exist with some material, or must have some material existence. But then there's a third class of things which the astronomer Ptolemy said sort of are in between these two, and they're called mathematical things. And mathematical things are unique because they can exist in both of those other two categories. Mathematical things can be present in metaphysical things, and they can also be present in physical things. And so mathematicals are seen by the philosopher Pythagoras and by his followers like Nicomachus here. Mathematical things are seen as the key to wisdom. They're the key thing to understand, because if we understand mathematical things, we can then understand both the natural world, physical things, and the supernatural world, or the immaterial things. So the focus of ancient philosophy, and Pythagoras came before Socrates. So in pre-Socratic philosophy, Pythagoras was the leader of the pursuit of wisdom through the study of mathematicals or mathematical things. And when we get into the introduction to arithmetic here, and as we go on to classical geometry and music and astronomy, that's what we'll be studying. We'll be studying the four different kinds of mathematical things. So when he talks about bodiless things, some of the things that he lists here, for example, qualities, we can think about qualities as colors and other sorts of things that we would name with adjectives, which would exist in physical bodies, right? We can see how these things, once understood in themselves, can then be applied to understand all sorts of physical things. Now, the reason why we can't study physical things themselves, and the reason why mathematical study or this intellectual philosophical pursuit of knowledge is better than a study of physical things, is because in order to study physical things logically, you would have to be able to study all of them. Because if you think about the rules of logic, if we want to draw a conclusion about something, the rules of logic teach us that we can't make any logical conclusion that begins with a particular statement. We can't start with a particular statement and then draw some logical conclusion. I can't say something like, some men are wise. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is wise. You can see how if we start with a premise that's not universal, but we say some men are wise, there's really nothing that we can draw from it. So if we're thinking about physical things, as we do, let's say, in natural science, the only way that we could draw a certain conclusion, a conclusion that's absolutely certain and sure, the only way we could draw such a conclusion would be to study all physical things. We would have to study every single instance We'd have to understand the entire class of things experimentally or sensibly. And then from that universal knowledge, we can then apply it and draw particular conclusions. But with physical things, that's not possible because physical things are infinite in number, constantly changing, constantly being born, constantly dying, and so on. It's just this infinite, constantly changing class of things that cannot be studied in an experimental way for the sake of drawing absolutely certain conclusions. And so the philosophers, the ancient philosophers, intentionally chose not to pursue the scientific method for this reason. They said, no, that can't possibly lead us to the kind of knowledge that we want, the kind of absolutely certain, unchanging scientific knowledge that we want. Scientific experimentation can't lead us to that knowledge, and therefore we must dig deeper and think more carefully about what might be studied that could give us a knowledge of the world, not just the material world, but also the immaterial world, that could be absolutely certain, that we could actually build our lives on and trust in and know that it's reliable. They knew that the scientific method, trying to seek knowledge of material things by observation, they knew that that could not lead to the universal scientific knowledge that wise men desired. And so the study of mathematical things became the focus. And we see this especially in the Pythagorean philosophy, and which then moves into Platonism and is then perfected under Aristotle. So we see this attention to mathematical things, and we might say, well, Aristotle doesn't seem to talk much about mathematical things, and one of the reasons why is because the mathematical philosophy had already been established pretty strongly in the Pythagorean tradition. And Aristotle didn't see that as a science that required investigation. It was already pretty well known before Aristotle. And Aristotle spent his time getting into the other fields of philosophy, and most importantly into logic, which is the method, the philosophical method itself. So we might not think of Aristotle as a mathematical philosopher, but if we read the works of Aristotle, we'll find all of the principles of mathematical philosophy throughout his works, because that mathematical tradition had already been established before him. That wasn't the problem that he needed to solve. And then when we look at Nicomachus here in the introduction to Arithmetic, we're reading a follower of Pythagoras from many centuries later. And we see that this mathematical philosophical tradition is already well established. So that's why it's not necessarily associated with Aristotle, but it's still part of true classical philosophy. So we've got these three classes of things: metaphysical, mathematical, and physical. Physical things that actually exist in bodies and can be sensed. Metaphysical things which never exist in bodies and cannot be sensed. And then mathematical things which are kind of in between the two. They can be used to understand metaphysical things, but they can also be used to understand physical things. And again, that's why they were considered the key to wisdom. Right now, the other objection that the ancient philosophers made is that it's impossible for us to know anything about metaphysical things. It's impossible for us to know about God, for example. And this is true. This is true even for us as Christians. The Catholic Catechism teaches very clearly that it's impossible for us to know anything positively or say anything literally and positively about God. We simply cannot know God. He's unknowable to us by nature. But he reveals himself, and he reveals himself. He can't reveal himself directly to us. So he reveals himself by means primarily of comparisons and analogies. So we can know some things about God, what's sufficient for our salvation. We can know some things, not by means of philosophy, but we can know them because God reveals them to us. And once God reveals things, because the things that God reveals are absolutely certain, they're basically received by faith as axioms, we can then allow them to enter into our reasoning and lead us to draw logical conclusions about many subjects that we wouldn't be able to reason about otherwise. So we can know about metaphysical things, theological things, primarily by means of divine revelation. We can also do so by analogy, as we'll see. But this Pythagorean tradition focuses on mathematicals because they can help us to understand metaphysicals, and they can also help us to understand physical things. And just to finish that up, physical things also can't be studied because, as I said, they're infinite. And so there's no way that we can know anything about them for certain. They're constantly changing. There's just no way to gather philosophical knowledge or science directly from the study of individual sensible things because they themselves are constantly changing. So mathematical studies, the study of the quadrivium, the four mathematical arts, was considered the way to wisdom in this Pythagorean tradition, and it's never really changed. Aristotle actually builds on that with his philosophy. So we see that in chapter 1, we're introduced to that idea of real things, things that never change, and we're told that they're bodiless things. They're things that cannot exist in matter because matter is constantly changing. Now, as I said, that all sounds pretty simple. It's not complicated to understand that. It's easy to follow 3 different kinds of things, one non-material, one material, one that's sort of in between the two. It's easy to understand that. But when we've got people who are skeptical about immaterial things and they're not willing to grant, for example, that the world was created or that there was some unmovable first mover or that anything immaterial actually exists, they can just deny the existence of metaphysical things and focus on physical things. And this is what the ancient Epicureans did. So if you want to know what the Epicureans believed, I can explain it real quick because they rejected or denied that there was any immaterial thing that actually existed, much like modern scientists do. They reject anything spiritual or immaterial. That's an assumption that they start with. They refuse to accept the existence of anything that's not material. Well, the Epicureans would take, for example, a river, let's say the Nile River, and they would say, we've got this name, Nile River, and we talk about the Nile River, we can look at a map and say, there's the Nile River. But what really is the Nile River? What is the Nile River? It's just really like a place or where water is constantly flowing. But we look at the water in a picture and we say, oh, that's the Nile River. But the philosopher would argue and say, like, but there's nothing actually there. It's just this constantly changing body of water. It's constantly changing. The same water is never actually there for any length of time. It's constantly changing. It never actually exists. And yet we give it a name and talk about it as if it's some stable thing that exists, and there's no such thing. So the Epicureans developed a philosophy known as atomism, where they believed that there really is nothing that exists in the physical world in itself. There's no such thing as a Nile River. There's no such thing as a tree or a man or anything really. They were atomists, and what they believed is the only thing that actually exists are atoms. And don't get this too confused with modern science, but to the ancient Epicureans, an atom was just some unknown physical body that couldn't be divided any further. So it was sort of the ultimate magnitude, the final magnitude, the last thing that cannot be divided. And it was considered the only thing that really existed. There were just atoms, they exist, and then there was just space in between atoms, or vacuum, or void, different words used for them. There were just atoms and voids, and everything was just composed of some constantly changing collection of atoms for whatever reason, right? But it was just atoms and void. And so what happens is when we deny the existence of supernatural things, when we deny the existence of immaterial things, we say no such things exist. There are no immaterial causes of anything in the world. We just reject that from the beginning. And we're left to focus entirely on the material world. What happens is we're forced to move towards atomism because physical things we observe are just constantly changing. If I look out at the trees right now, they're covered with leaves here in North Carolina. But these leaves are not the leaves that were there last March. This is a different set of leaves. The trees are of different size. They've grown new bark. They're thicker than they were. They've got parts on them that they didn't have last year. So is the tree in my front yard really the same thing as the tree that was in my front yard last year? And what about the leaves that fell off and blew away? Are they part of this tree, or do they have their own existence? You can see how focusing entirely on the physical world leads us to realize that nothing is permanent, nothing is stable, everything is constantly changing and moving, and therefore, really, nothing exists. So materialism, rather than leading us to this idea that physical things are the only things that are real, it actually leads us to an idea that nothing is real. Nothing really exists, but everything is just composed of these invisible, indivisible atoms, and everything is constantly changing. Who knows why, right? They don't answer many why questions, which is part of the problem with their philosophy. And as they try to pretend like they've got a philosophical system, really all that it is a denial of true philosophy. They simply reject the notion that anything immaterial can exist. They reject that, and their philosophy really is just rejecting the truth. It's similar to Protestantism, because if you think about Protestantism, even the name Protestant, it really doesn't have its own existence. It's just not Catholicism. That's what it really is. It's a skeptical school of thought that simply denies some other school of thought. It doesn't have its own positive identity. It identifies in the negative. And really, atomism or this materialism is really just a skeptical philosophy. It doesn't have its own identity. It doesn't have its own answers. Can't explain things in a positive way. It simply denies something else. And Pythagoras won't have any of that. Pythagoras and Nicomachus here in the Arithmetic says, no, we believe in the existence of immaterial things, and the importance of immaterial things, the importance of these invisible substances, these invisible realities, is that they are actually what gives us our essence. So if you were to look at me and say, what is William Michael? He's this constantly changing collection of atoms. And that's true physically. If you were to look, you would find that my body is constantly shedding cells inside my body. Cells are constantly dying. I'm a constant flux of cells and atoms. That's true. So what is it about me that actually identifies me as me? What is William Michael? What is the Nile River? What are these things? Right? What actually gives us our identity? What is our essence? And so for philosophers, for true philosophers, the answer lies with immaterial things. There's something about William Michael that's invisible, that's imperceptible, and that really makes him to be what he is. And the same is true of you. Physically, I'm a constant flux of cells being born and dying, atoms multiplying and dividing, and so on. And yet, in spite of that, there's something here that's actually me, and there's something with you that's actually you. And that's our essence. And we have to go beyond the physical things, beyond the material, to understand what it is that gives us our essence. And when we think of it like that, thinking of God is quite simple, because God is simply an essence without a physical body. It's not that difficult to understand. God is simple. God is actually more perfect than us. And so we can think of God quite simply by thinking about our own essence. And why that's important is because if you go back to ancient philosophy, they always refer to this phrase, know thyself, know thyself, know thyself. And what that means is to think about yourself and ask yourself, what am I? What am I? Look in the mirror and ask yourself, what am I? Who is it that's looking through these eyes? When I talk about myself, who am I actually talking about? Because if you cut off my arm, I would still be here. So there's something about me that's essential and permanent, and yet it's not my physical body. It's something more mysterious. And so the idea know thyself means to examine yourself and consider what exactly are you? And once you come to understand that, once you come to understand as a human being what you actually are, then the challenge is to live a life that's consistent with who you are, what you are, to live a life of a rational animal made in the image and likeness of God, to actually live like such a person. That's the challenge of ancient philosophy. But when we deal with materialists like Epicureans or many modern philosophers, we find that they start out by just refusing to accept the existence of any immaterial things and then try to build a worldview that is entirely materialistic. And the the challenge that I have for anyone who gets into that sort of thinking, or if you go to college and take physics classes and biology and chemistry classes and talk to especially physicists, talk to them, you'll find that while they have lots of theories and ideas and explanations for things, they can put together all kinds of models and systems. What I'd like you to ask yourself is, does it feel like they're moving from ignorance to greater certainty, or does it feel like they're moving from ignorance to even more uncertainty? Does it feel like by abandoning the idea of the existence of immaterial causes, when we deny that, do we move from some sort of chaotic, confusing, superstitious thought to some clear, stable, more reasonable thought, or do we actually move into greater chaos? And what you'll see is materialism leads us into greater chaos. It asks us to believe things and assume things that are even more difficult to believe than the things that belief in an immaterial world and immaterial causes would ever ask us to believe. So it's just a strange thing. And there's a saying among philosophers that a little bit of science will make you an atheist. But if you go deep into the study of natural science, it will lead you to theism or to belief in God, because there's no other explanation. There's no way to explain things as they are materially. And today's a perfect example. There's no way to explain an eclipse materially. There's no way to explain how these randomly floating bodies in outer space, however many hundreds of thousands or millions of miles apart, will just happen to align. I mean, think about the odds of having the sun and the moon align just so that the light of the sun is perfectly blocked by the moon from the vantage point of the earth. If all of these things are random and chaotic and moving by chance and so on, the idea of a recurring eclipse would be relatively impossible. And so you can see that the materialistic worldview will then ask us to believe something that's more ridiculous, which is that, oh, well, it may seem like it's impossible, but the reason why it's possible is because time is just infinite. So, if I was to roll a couple of a handful of dice, let's say, and I was to say, what's the chance that I could get all sixes? Let's say I roll five die. What's the chance I can get all sixes? You could say, well, you're going to have to roll it hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of times to get all sixes. There's so many possibilities for different combinations. The only way that you could say it's possible would be to continually multiply the number of chances. And then you could say, well, that's possible. How about if I rolled it just 4 times? Is it possible or probable that I'd get all sixes? You'd say, no way. Definitely not. How about if I rolled it 1,000 times? Well, maybe if you did it 1,000 times, you might get all sixes. Well, I can easily solve this by saying, well, I'm just going to roll it infinite times. I'm just going to roll it 650 billion times. And then all of a sudden the possibility becomes, it becomes probable. Yeah, you're probably right. If you roll it 650 billion times, you probably end up with all sixes. And that's how materialists will explain something like an eclipse. It's just because these bodies in the heavens have been moving around for so many gazillions of years that we just happen to live at the moment when nature rolls all sixes. That's just how it is. And it may never happen again. It may change, whatever. But then you see that the astronomers say, yeah, but this can happen again in another 20 or so years or 70, however, whatever the intervals are. And that's where the materialism begins to really fall apart, where we notice that there's patterns and rhythms in things, and it appears that there's an intentional and permanent design. They can't explain that. And again, they ask us to just believe something more absurd, that it just happens to be coincidental because these things have been moving as they are, chaotically, spontaneously by their own natures for gazillions of years or even from eternity. That's harder for me to believe. It's harder for me to believe that there are material things that are eternal than it is to believe that there are immaterial things that are eternal. The immaterial or metaphysical view is easier to believe and makes more sense than the material view. But you can see how all of that starts from a denial, just by the will of the philosopher, a denial of the existence of immaterial things because they can't be perceived with the senses, even though they can be comprehended by reason. But just to deny them and demand that we actually prove their existence to the senses, which is irrational itself. But then once you establish materialism, you're asked to believe things that are even more difficult to believe and more irrational. And that's what we see today in modern natural science. We really see just a revival of materialism. So getting back to Nicomachus here, and the reason why I'm spending some time on this philosophical stuff is that chapter 2 is actually quite short, and we're going to get through it pretty quickly. But Nicomachus is focusing us on the mathematicals, those things that are in between metaphysical and physical, things which can be present in both the metaphysical things that never connect with bodies, and the physical things which do. So they're the means, the bridge, as it were, to both the invisible and the visible world. It's interesting because you can see in this arrangement in philosophy, you can see something that sort of parallels the teaching of Christianity, where we've got God as this incomprehensible spiritual being that just cannot be known to us. Not only is he spiritual, but he's superior to us. He's infinite, eternal, unchanging, omnipotent, and so on. We can't even comprehend what he might be. And we start with that, and we can compare God to the metaphysical world of philosophy. And then we look at man, and man is sort of like the physical world, or we may even think of plants and animals would be even a better illustration of the physical things, where they can be understood by their own, but they can't be understood apart from their physical existence. And then if we think of something like the incarnation, right? We think of the incarnation where you've got this mysterious union between the physical things and the metaphysical things in the person of Christ. The incarnation is sort of this mathematical reality. If you can think of it like that, it gives you a good sense of why this mathematical class of things becomes so interesting and exciting to philosophers, because it really is that which connects these two separated fields of knowledge, these two separate classes of things. And we find that in religion and in our own existence, that Christ is sort of this bridge that no man has ever seen God. No one can know God. He's incomprehensible, and yet we read in the Gospel of John that the Son of God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has come and dwelt among us, and he has explained him. Jesus said to his disciples, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father." Think how mysterious and bizarre that is. You have seen the Father. That's mysterious talk. So you can see why the ancient philosophers would enjoy these investigations into the mathematical world. And to be honest, if we could recover this sense of mathematics, if we could recover this sense of mathematics as a means of helping us to understand not just the material world with sort of a Newtonian modern physics idea, but also understand the metaphysical world, I think we'd find a lot more attraction as Christian people to the study of mathematics. And hopefully our study of classical arithmetic and geometry and so on will stir that up in us. So anyway, with all of that introductory information behind us, as I said, we went back a little bit, looked at chapter 1 to see that this is in fact what Nicomachus is talking about here. And now in chapter 2, we really start to move from this introduction into the real stuff of the study of classical mathematics. So let's read this together, and I'll just comment as I feel it's necessary to make sure everything is clear. Right, and don't forget, because most students seeing this video will see it as a recording. Help is always available to you. If you read through this and there's a word you don't understand, or there's an idea that you just can't seem to wrap your brain around, post your questions on the student forums, on the course pages, on the study center. You can post as often as you want to. Any questions you have, feel free to post them on there. Just so you know, when you post a question on a forum, and this didn't used to be the case, but it is now. When you post on the forum, that forum comment that you post is automatically sent to me as a ticket in our support system. So I'll see every comment on any forum that you post, and I'll be able to get back to you there on the support forum, which is also good for other students. And then you can also see those support forums if there's something you can help another student with. It'd be good for you to do so. But any questions that come up, curious thoughts, application questions, difficulties with vocabulary, certain ideas you just can't seem to wrap your brain around, post those questions on the forum. Most of the time I'll be able to help you, and if I can't, sometimes other students will have already figured that out, or for some reason they understand what you don't, and sometimes you can just help each other. So post on the forums, and if you don't feel comfortable posting on the forum, if it's something maybe it's a little more personal that's got to do with your studies, you can just send us an email. So make sure as we read through this, and if you're watching this as a recorded video, you know that even if you don't attend a live class, help is always available. You just have to make sure you reach out with your questions, and don't be afraid of asking too much. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 2 here. In chapter 2, we sort of move from the introduction to the real study of classical mathematics. So let's read this together. Those things, Nicomachus says, those things are immaterial, eternal, and without end, infinite, immaterial, eternal, and without end, and it is their nature to persist or remain, ever the same and unchanging, abiding by their own essential being, and each one of them is called real in the proper sense. So we're getting here the idea of what it means for something to be real. And again, think back to what I said about the Epicureans. Is the Nile River real? Am I real? Or what am I really? What am I? If we look at ourselves materially, there really is no answer to that question. And we see the chaos in our society where people can't even figure out what gender they are. You just see how this materialism leads you into this craziness, this total chaos of thought. But we ask the question, what am I really? What am I? Who am I? What is a tree really? What is the sun really? What is this world really? What is God really? And what we're trying to get at is, what is it about me that makes me me, that doesn't change? I'm 49 years old. That's not me. Yeah, and it's an interesting question to think about, to ask, if we do go to heaven and we have a body in heaven forever, will it be 49-year-old me? Will I look like this? Or will I look like I did when I was 33? Or will I look like I did when I was 18 or when I was 12? What would my physical appearance actually be like in heaven? If Saint Joseph died as an old man, in heaven, would he appear as an old man or would he appear as 35-year-old Joseph? Jesus died as a 33-year-old man. We wouldn't expect him to appear as an 80-year-old man in heaven. We wouldn't expect him to appear as a 15-year-old boy in heaven. And you see how thinking about the body in an eternal framework, it leads us to wonder, what exactly would my body be like in heaven? What exactly am I? At 49 years old, is this me? This image here, is this me? Or when I was 20 years younger, is that me? What would my body actually look like forever? What would the real me look like? That's what we're trying to get to. And so we're asking that about God. What is God really? Not what is God in a certain moment, in a certain event, in a certain place or time, but what is God really? What is God always? What is God eternally? What am I always? What am I really? What is a tree really? Not this particular tree or that particular tree. I'm talking about tree. What is a tree really? That's what philosophy seeks to get into. More scientific, unchanging knowledge that actually becomes useful in all circumstances. That's the difference. All right? Things which are immaterial, because physical things are constantly changing. So the reality can't be in the bodies. It can't be in the physical thing. The physical things are constantly changing. We could look forward to eternity and say one quality that must be true of a glorified body would be that it never changes. Because if it did change, it would be imperfect and it wouldn't really exist. It'd be accidental like our bodies now. And to change, you can only change for the better or for the worse. And so it'd be kind of strange to think that we would change in eternity. So whatever we are in eternity, and we're talking about existing in a body, that body has to be unchanging. So there's got to be an essence of what the human body really is that could exist in eternity forever. Things which are immaterial, eternal, without end, and it is their nature to persist, ever the same and unchanging, abiding by their own essential being, what they truly are, essentially. Each one of them is called real in this proper sense. That's what a thing really is. But things that are involved in birth and destruction, so physical bodies, things that are involved in birth and destruction, growth and diminution, which means decreasing in size, all kinds of change and participation, these are seen to vary continually, constantly. And while we call them real things, by the same term, we use the same name as we use to refer to those unchanging things. We call them real things. So far as they partake of those unchanging things, they are not actually real by their own nature because they do not abide. They do not persist for even the shortest moment in the same condition, but are always passing over into all sorts of changes. So really trying to narrow down what it is that we mean when we talk about real things which exist as they are without changing, the real essential being of a thing. To quote the words of Timaeus in Plato, and just so you know, this work by Plato called the Timaeus, it's one of his dialogues where Socrates discusses philosophical questions with other men, written by Plato, but spoken by Socrates in the work. The Timaeus is where you should go if you want to learn about Plato's view of the world, right? The understanding of the universe, things like that. Plato discusses that in the Timaeus. So to quote the words of the Timaeus, or of Timaeus, who's a man who's speaking in that dialogue, in Plato, quote, "What is that which always is?" And you should underline the word is. What is that which always is and has no birth? And what is that which is always becoming something else, but never is? What is that which always is? And what is that which is always becoming, but never is? This is the difference in these classes of two things, real things and things that may appear to be real, but actually aren't. Now, when you think about this use of the word is, right? Plato says, what is that which always is? You can see the significance of the name that God gives Moses when Moses says, what is your name? And God answers and says, I am. He who is. That's the answer that God gives to Moses. This is why I always say, when people say we don't need philosophy, we just need to study the Bible, or we just need, the Bible's full of philosophy. The problem is Christians who don't study philosophy are just not aware of it. They don't see it because they can't comprehend the significance of many of the things that they read. But when God says to Moses, who was educated in Egyptian philosophy, which was mathematical, God says to Moses, I am. To Moses, that was very significant. To people influenced by Egyptian philosophy, that was a very significant, a profound and brilliant answer to the question. If there was one eternal God, one creator of everything, who existed from eternity to eternity, and we were to ask his name, it would make perfect sense that his name would be I am, or the one who is. That's what his name would be. And that name could only be true of the creator of all things. And so that response to Moses' question is a brilliant response. It's a profound philosophical response, and that's the point of that response. God is revealing to Moses, and to anyone who's philosophical, he's revealing who and what he actually is. The only name that he can be given is the one who is. That's the idea. The real thing, the immaterial, infinite, unchanging, eternal creator of all things, the first cause of all things. So that's the idea. You can see that even Plato, 350 years or so before Christ, Plato is digging into this issue. What is that which always is and has no birth? What is that which is eternal? And what is that which is always becoming but never is? The one is apprehended by the mental processes with reasoning and is always the same. The other can be guessed at by opinion in company with unreasoning sense, a thing which becomes and passes away, but never really is. Never really is. Never exists in that kind of persisting, permanent, unchanging way. One is perceived by means of the senses, that which is bodily and constantly changing, and therefore our senses are inferior as a source of learning. And that which is, which always persists as it is not perceived by the senses, which only can perceive that which is changing, but it's perceived by the mental processes with reasoning. And so we can see that when God created us and gave us the gift or faculty of reason, he gave us what we needed to be able to apprehend him. He gave us what we need to be able to think of things beyond the physical world, beyond the world that is observed by our senses. He gave us eyes to see physical things, ears, nose, mouth, hands, skin, and so on to sense material things. But he also gave us reason to perceive, as it were, invisible things, insensible things. We were made to perceive both. Animals were not. So if that's the case, then those things which are perceived, which are greater, must be perceived by the greater faculty. Therefore, our reasoning faculty must be greater than our senses. And therefore, a wise man will direct his attention and focus his attention on that which is apprehended by means of reason, and not so much that which is apprehended by the senses. Now, when we come to modern science, you might think, well, it's pretty stupid then in modern science to say we're going to go seek the truth by means of our senses. I mean, that's pretty dumb. Like, we all know our senses can mislead us. We can make all kinds of mistakes thinking we see things. I mean, like, what are we thinking about in our dreams where we see all kinds of bizarre things? Like, obviously we shouldn't trust our senses. How many times do our senses mislead us? We feel like we're falling or something. Or, if you've ever sat in a parking lot and you're sitting in your car and the car next to you starts to move and you panic because you feel like your car's rolling, where it's just the other car moving. Your senses can easily mislead you. If we look at the sky, the sun looks like it's about the size of a nickel. Reason tells us no, it appears small because it's at a far distance and things appear smaller at a distance. Reason tells us how to understand what our senses perceive. Our senses by themselves are stupid, right? So to say we're going to give ourselves to investigate the world by means of the senses in modern science, that seems like a really dumb idea. And so the modern scientists have to adjust that to say, well, we're not going to seek this knowledge by means of our senses. We're going to seek this knowledge by means of our senses with the help of instruments that we invent, like telescopes and microscopes and so on. So you see, the senses aren't that bad. Really, we just need to make them stronger. If we just had stronger senses, then this whole problem would go away. But you see, what's really at the heart of that is a desire to deny the existence of immaterial things which are perceived or apprehended by reason. Now, as you go into modern philosophy, you can look up names like Spinoza and Hume, especially Hume, whose, these modern philosophers are at work around the same time as the modern scientific method and scientific revolution develop. You'll see that that's what they're actually doing. They're actually arguing that reason is not reliable and that we should follow our passions because that's what we really are, that reason can actually lead us astray, and our passions are natural. That's what God actually made us to be. He made us to be moved by our passions. So we're angry at certain things, or we're pleased with certain things, we're saddened by certain things. That's how God made us. Therefore, that's how we should live. That's what modern philosophy teaches. We can hear this all the time. If we hear a controversial issue like questions about homosexuality, we'll hear things like, well, this is how God made me. Like these are my desires by nature. These are my instincts, my impulses. This is how I'm made. And you see that there's an aversion to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. This may be my instinct, but I'm a fallen creature, and I have reason to sort of rule over and examine these instincts, just like reason rules over and examines what appears to my senses. Reason is supposed to be in charge. Modern philosophy rejects that and says we should not live subject to reason. So if you pay attention to the news and just read the headlines or watch the daily news and you sit there thinking to yourself, what in the world is going on? Like, how can people even say these crazy things? How can people honestly say that we should think about living on Mars. How can someone even suggest that when Mars is colder than Antarctica? There's no oxygen on Mars. There's no water on Mars. There's no food on Mars. We're talking about, if the temperature of the Earth changes 2 degrees, we're all going to explode and die, and it's this great climate change fiasco. If just a couple of degrees of change, or if the ocean level rises a couple of inches, cities are going to be flooded and all. But you can move to Mars where there isn't even any water, and it's 70 degrees colder than Antarctica. You listen to the things people say in modern society and you wonder, like, how can we, am I crazy? Am I crazy to think that this is like totally irrational maniac talk here? Or is it really crazy talk? And the answer is, it is really crazy talk, because modern society and modern philosophy does not believe that man should be led by anything called reason. They think reason is sort of a myth, or is actually the problem. You see, it's crazy, but it all can be drawn back to one of two things. It either goes back to a desire to rebel against moral implications of true philosophy, or a desire to reject the existence of any immaterial thing, which is also connected to a moral problem. But we see this in modern society, and if you feel like the world is almost intentionally irrational, you're right, it is. It doesn't believe that what it says or does has to pass the reason test. It doesn't believe that. I mean, people like David Hume explicitly taught that. So things really are that crazy. But anyway, the mental processes with reasoning allow us to apprehend these truly existing things which actually are, and our senses are helpful to observe those things which constantly change, but even the senses need to be governed and enlightened and directed by reason. So he goes on to say, therefore, if we crave for the goal that is worthy and fitting for a man, namely happiness of life, happiness, this isn't some abstract study. If we want to be happy, this is accomplished by philosophy alone and by nothing else. And philosophy means for us the desire for wisdom, and wisdom is the science of truth in things. And of things, some are properly called real things, others merely share the name. It is therefore reasonable and most necessary to distinguish and systematize the accidental qualities of things. The accidental qualities, because the bodily things constantly change, the immaterial things can't be known. And so if we consider, well, what's there to study then? The qualities of these things are the things that may be studied and known that will never change. So it's leading us to a philosophical study of the qualities of things, qualities that will apply to immaterial things and qualities that will also apply to material things. He then goes on to say, things then, both those properly so called and those that simply have the name, are some of them unified and continuous. That means they are one thing. Some things are one in number, things that we think of as existing as one. And he gives some examples. An animal is one thing. The universe, one thing. A tree, and so on. These are properly and peculiarly called magnitudes. Magnitudes. And what magnitudes really means are things that are measured by how much. How much. So it's a single body, and the way that a single body is measured is by dividing it. Okay, so magnitudes are measured and thought of by means of division. The other kind of things, the other kind of real things, are discontinuous, in a side-by-side arrangement, and as it were in heaps, and these are called multitudes. A flock, for example, a people, a nation made up of many individuals, the individual people being set as a discontinued quantity side by side. a chorus, and so on, made up of individual, separate individuals, not parts, separate individuals. So we've got magnitudes that are one whole thing made up of parts, and we've got multitudes, which is a collection of magnitudes. All right, make sure you keep that clear. Wisdom then must be considered to be the knowledge of these two forms, magnitude and multitude. Since, however, all multitude and magnitude are by their own nature infinite, magnitude and multitude are by their own nature infinite. And if you're confused by that and you wonder, what does that mean? He explains it in the next line. Multitude starts from a definite root, namely the collection of things, as one, and never ceases increasing. So you can increase multitude forever by addition. And so multitude can be multiplied forever. On the other hand, magnitude, when division begins with a limited whole and is carried on, that process of dividing can never come to an end, but proceeds to infinity. So if you take a thing and cut it into a half, and then a half, and then a half, and then a half, that division can continue forever. It will never end. You'll never reach the end. But since sciences are always sciences of limited things, we can't study infinites. It is accordingly evident that a science dealing with magnitude per se, or with multitude per se, that is in and of themselves, could never be formulated. For each of them is limitless in itself. Multitude is infinite with respect to more, or the ability to be increased. Magnitude is infinite with respect to, or in the direction of, the less, or the ability to be divided endlessly. A science, however, would arise to deal with something that is separated from or abstracted from each of them. Quantity would be that which is separated from multitude, and size would be that which is separated from magnitude. So quantity is the proper subject of a science of multitude, and quantity, right? No, size, sorry, I couldn't find it. Quantity is the study of multitude, and size is the study of magnitude. So we have quantity and size become the two sciences that need to be investigated, because we can't investigate multitude and magnitude directly, but we can study these attributes drawn from them or abstracted from them, quantity and size. And then in chapter 3, we're going to see that quantity and size each divide into two sciences. Quantity divides into arithmetic and music, and size divides into geometry and astronomy. And that's where we get the 4 mathematical arts from. So that's all for chapter 2. It's a short chapter, but there's a lot of important information packed in there, and it's very important in light of modern philosophy and stuff that we see going on today. You can understand what's going on by learning ancient philosophy and then thinking, what is it in ancient philosophy that these modern people are rejecting? Because that's what helps us to understand why they think the way they do, why the way they act the way they do. They're not creating a new positive philosophy. Their philosophy is simply the rejection of true philosophy. And by studying true philosophy like this, we can identify what it is that they're doing wrong. Now, notice one last thing. When Nicomachus here notices that we can't study multitude and magnitude because they're infinite. There's no way for us to study them. Notice how, being a wise man, he's aware of that. And so he realizes that he must seek wisdom someplace else. And he says, we can abstract from multitude and study quantity. We can abstract from magnitude and study size. He figures out where the truth can be found. Modern science doesn't do this. Modern science has chosen to study physical things. And even though it knows, scientists know that they can never study material things because they're infinite. They know that. But instead of acknowledging that they either have to abandon that study or find some other study that relates to it that actually is finite, they simply go on, almost spitefully, pretending like they're heading towards some end when they are never, ever going to reach any end, because the universe goes on like multitude, the universe goes on infinitely. They'll never be able to explain it. And in the same way, when we go down into cells and atoms and molecules and things like that, it's just like magnitude. It divides infinitely. It's going to go on forever. You're going to figure out one thing and then discover there's a whole nother layer. It divides further and it divides further and it divides further. And anytime you try to stop and talk about something as if you've reached the end, you know you're lying to yourself, because it goes further and further and further. And we will never know the truth of anything. There will never be any true science based on the investigation of material things, either towards multitude, right, with respect to the heavens and the universe, or into the microscopic world with respect to invisible atoms and molecules, and then electrons and protons and neutrons, and then you go further to quarks, and it just goes further and further and further, and it's going to keep going further. And we're not getting any closer to any knowledge because it's infinite in both directions. So anyway, that's all for lesson 2. I hope that's helpful in helping you get through this reading for the first time if you're making this first reading. I hope it starts to help you to think about the issues and the subjects that apply to these philosophical issues, and how our study of classical arithmetic can help us to gain wisdom, knowledge that's not just encyclopedic knowledge about some things, but that's actually wisdom about entire classes of things that leads us to a more stable and certain understanding of both metaphysical things, which are helpful with theology and religion, and physical things, which help us in everyday practical life, and most importantly, which help us understand ourselves, who are these weird composite beings made of both body and soul. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. That's all for today, chapter 2. We ran a little bit late, but I think that's helpful. If you've got any questions, I'm going to wrap up for now, but if you've got any questions, please post them on the student forums, on the course pages on the Study Center, or just send them along by email. I hope that's helpful. God bless.